Hi, class. Let's begin with the question of what is anthropology and what types of fields do we find within this discipline that we call anthropology. Anthropology is derived from two words in Greek, logos, the study of, plus anthropos, which means mankind. Now, this is a little bit of an unfortunate history, and it's good to reflect on it because at one point of time, most ways of referring to studies were done so in the masculine. So we like to correct that. We like to look back at the history and say, yes, at one point of time, people were sexist, and now we recognize that we're interested in a heck of a lot more than just men. We're never just interested in men. Instead, we're interested in humankind. So this becomes the subject of anthropology. Humankind in all of its diversity, in all of its variation over time and space. There's a lot in there. So you can imagine anthropology being such a broad area of study. Um, we do need a number of different fields that can adequately get at some of the questions about humankind that we want to elicit. So let's think of anthropology as a pie or a whole here. And we can divide this pie into a number of pieces. So in traditional, or as our textbook refers to, four-field anthropology, we're going to divide this pie into four basic pieces. And that's going to become our four fields. And within every field, we're going to find subfields or further specializations. So linguistic anthropology, this is one of the fields of anthropology, and linguistic anthropologists are interested in language, modern language as it's spoken today, but also the origin of languages as well. So which one of our ancestors, for example, began to speak first? Are there biological components to speech? Are there genetic components to speech? And how and why does language change over time? Give you an example of a linguistic reflection that allows us to comment on perhaps where we are today. I remember my daughter was playing soccer, girls soccer, and one day the coach was saying, come on, guys, you can do it." And I looked around and I didn't see any guys on the pitch. They were just females. And at that point of time, I asked myself, well, what would happen if on my son's game day, if the coach had reversed the language and said, come on, gals, you can do it? I think people would take offense. So it allows us to reflect again on perhaps some of these double standards. And while we're trying to move to a society that doesn't emphasize the importance of masculinity over femininity, for example, linguistically, we hear something very different. It's okay to call females guys, but it's not okay to call a guy a gal. That would be taken as an insult. So this gives us a little bit of insight into linguistic anthropology, some of the more modern questions that we can ask. However, if we go a little bit deeper, we're interested in the origins of language. And this is one of the things that we are going to focus on in greater depth. So I'm going to give you a very quick example here that we'll discuss a little bit further. Please do not try to copy this. It is not possible. And I certainly won't test you on all of this information. But in the same way that we understand that humans are connected genetically and we have these genetic relationships, to a linguistic anthropologist or a linguist, we can also hear those linguistic connections. So while Sanskrit may seem like a very distant language in comparison to Scottish, for example, or High German or Spanish, on this model, we can see that everything is interconnected and traces back to a main language family. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Peter later on, but just kind of opening this up, and you can briefly see the connections that exist between this old word Peter and the cognates or the connections that exist today. So from Peter, pater, that's very obvious. This is a word that's used for father. Like I said, we'll discuss it a little bit further, but just to give you an example of this kind of evolutionary tree of language, so we can do this for our Indo-European languages. This is also true of Afro-Asiatic languages, and on and on. Moving on to the second field, arbitrary here, but the second field in anthropology, we want to define that as cultural anthropology. Cultural anthropologists are interested in documenting the beliefs, the traditions, the customs of various people around the world. Sometimes people refer to their subject matter as culture. Um, Not necessarily. We're interested in people and their societies and the culture that those societies possess. And that's exactly what we want to do is we want to document that information and see how things are interconnected. So cultural anthropologists, here we see Bronislaw Malinowski, a great example of a cultural anthropologist who eventually decided to get off of the armchair. At one time, that's where anthropology was done, like a lot of other sciences. It was a type of philosophy, a type of theorizing. However, Bronislaw Malinowski decided you can't do anthropology from an armchair. You have to go out and live with other people, as scary as that might be. You have to learn their language, and you have to engage in something that was referred to as participant observation. And later on, a lot of social sciences begin to utilize that particular field method of observing and doing with people in an attempt to document the shared systems of belief that people possess and how they organize their behavior. Moving on to the third field here, we're moving from more of the social science side of anthropology to more of a natural science, humanities side of anthropology. Now, anthropology is interesting in this respect because while we do the social sciences in the same way that sociology would be interested in human behavior, psychology, we also move into an area of natural sciences where we do biology, we do genetics, we extract lipids or fats from pottery shards. That's something that a sociology just doesn't do. So what we're looking at here is the emergence of something that we refer to as archaeology. Archaeological anthropology is interested in exploring ancient human culture, and it goes pretty far back. You know, when we're looking at archaeology, it really begins probably around 2.5 million years ago, as for the information that it's interested in excavating. Around 2.5 million years ago, that's when the first stone tools were created. So archaeological anthropology is interested in those ancient artifacts. So all of the stone tools during prehistory, that's kind of archaeological material. And as we progress further and we start to move into the rise of civilizations, the emergence of farming, the development of Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt, that stuff is archaeological subject matter as well. They're interested in excavating that material. The medieval period, any excavations that take place, for example, with respect to plague pits, that would be archaeological. So anything that involves digging up the past in an attempt to understand and interpret the history behind those particular periods and what was going on, uncovering the past. And you're probably hearing a similarity here to history. There is a lot of historians rely upon the archaeological material that has been excavated, and that assists them in building an understanding of the past. So, with respect to archaeology, I think for a lot of students, this is kind of a big draw in anthropology. And what usually comes to mind here, and we could advance our slide, is Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. And if it's not the idea of being an Indiana Jones with that fedora and bullwhip, perhaps the idea of Lara Croft, the Tomb Raider, a strong female figure engaged in archaeology. I think what a lot of students don't understand about archaeology is if you're going into an archaeological program at a university, you're not going to meet Indiana Jones, you're not going to meet Lara Croft. In contrast, you're going to meet somebody a little bit closer to Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte, yes, warmonger, but he was very interested in recovering information. And he's different than some of these figures that we do see in Hollywood. Indiana Jones, Lara Croft, Tomb Raiders. They're thieves. Indy ain't anything but a thief. He didn't do a good job recording the context that the artifacts were found within. In contrast, Napoleon Bonaparte, he employed a team of scientists to extract these treasures from the civilizations that he conquered. And in doing so, they began to meticulously record the context that the artifacts were found within. And that allows for proper archaeology. Along with the material artifacts that are recovered with any civilization, you also come across biological remains as well. So in more recent times, a subfield has emerged within this field of archaeology, and it's called bioarchaeology. And bioarchaeology is fascinating. It delves into questions about interpersonal violence, for example. It wants to theorize or interpret whether or not, for example, slaves existed in ancient Egypt. And one of the things that we know because of their research is absolutely not. It wasn't until the New Kingdom that slavery was adopted. All those pyramids were in fact built by people who willingly did so and were paid quite well. And that's based upon the examination and interpretation of the context that those people with injuries and evidence of heavy labor in their bones, they were buried in a highly respectable manner. So bioarchaeology then, it would look at, for example, we see a number of holes in this individual's head. We see 3 open holes, and just to the right of that largest open hole, we see one that's healed. And it's this type of analysis that allows us to say something about the past as well from a health perspective. What caused the holes in this person's head? Well, it wasn't a rodent. It was an individual who drilled those holes with a stone tool into that person's head. We call this process trephination. Why did people trephine? You know, we have theories, and we can draw upon some of the explanations that have been recorded from people. And one of the explanations that people offer is because they're possessed. And by drilling these holes in their head, they release those evil demons. Now, while that might sound far-fetched to us, if we apply a scientific perspective to it, and we say, okay, they historically, in ancient times, when people believed that illness was caused by spirits and demons, and they didn't know about viruses and bacteria and protozoa, all of those organisms that can make us sick, this perhaps was a way that they explained mental illness. So I think what's interesting about this, a lot of people, this individual certainly died as a result of this procedure. We don't see any evidence of healing in those areas that have been trephined, except for the earliest one. We see more of a divot that has healed. In many instances, trephination was not successful in that it got rid of um, mental illness. However, people did survive the procedure. So I think when we're looking at a number of holes, we're probably dealing with some sort of mental illness, schizophrenia perhaps, multiple personality disorder. Other reasons why people might engage in this is to release intracranial pressure. So we could examine the skull, we could see whether or not there are previous fractures, fractures that align with the time that an individual had this procedure done. And if so, then we have another theory. So looking at this individual, did they survive? Absolutely not. But in many instances, the archaeological record tells us that about 80% of people that had this procedure done, they survived. Bones do have a type of power. There's a power in the bones to reveal information about the past. They do have secrets. I think that's one of the ways that we could look at it. So here we're looking at the dentition, and we can see this isn't adult dentition, so this is the dentition of a young female, and it's not normal in the sense that that enamel is smooth. If you look at the enamel on those two front teeth, the incisors, you can see a series of lines running across them. That's something that we call enamel hypoplasia. And enamel hypoplasia gives us a glimpse into the development of this individual. And what it explains is this only occurs because of a malnutrition issue, or perhaps a disease that causes a metabolic issue, and again would produce these signs of malnutrition. When we look at enamel, normally our enamel is nice and smooth. These linear lines going across the teeth, it indicates that there's a problem. So moving on from archaeological anthropology, we have perhaps the most scientific um, discipline or field within anthropology. We can advance our slide here. And we call it physical anthropology. Physical anthropology sometimes is referred to as biological anthropology. This is the field of anthropology that inquires into human evolution. It's responsible for example, in more recent times, illustrating that all humans exited from Africa in a number of migrations. And they did that by tracing patterns, haplotypes, genes, markers in people's genes. And we're able to see that. Within physical anthropology, we're going to see a number of different specializations. So let's take a little closer look at physical anthropology. Advance our slide here. So physical anthropology, by and large, the area here is evolution, biology, genetics, but evolution. The evidence that we use or we're looking for ultimately in physical anthropology is derived from excavations. So in the same way that anthropologists excavate material culture and bio artifacts, so too do physical anthropologists. Except what they're excavating is so old, it's no longer organic material. And what they're finding is a fossil. So here on our screen, we see a number of different fossils. The types of fossils that we're looking at here is what we refer to as a cast. If you've been in the forest and you've looked at the underside, for example, of a rock, or sometimes break a rock open, some shale, you see an imprint. So there's a number of different types of fossils, and ultimately a fossil is some sort of an imprint of the past. And we can analyze that material. Now, at one point of time, anthropologists lined up skulls as they excavated them, and they looked at various features. For example, they were looking at the cranial capacity. And here we're looking at what appears to be, we're going to say, a Homo erectus, so we're in around 900 cc's, for example, cranial capacity, and we're moving on to a Neanderthal, and here we're going up to 1250, for example, cc's, plus even up to about 1400, and then we continue to see the brain as we progress through humans, more modern humans, it increases in the size. And going down to, say, an Australopithecine. I'll tell you more about Australopithecines later on. But if we looked at the cranial capacity there, we're looking at about 350 cc's in size. And what anthropologists did is they looked at cranial capacity and they said, see, let me get my highlighter here. They said, see, evolution. We see it. We're seeing change over time. And other important elements, they weren't just looking at change over time, but they had looked at the strata, for example, that this material was found in. So what is strata? Very briefly, archaeologists rely upon this as well. Just going to get us a proper color here. So when we look at, for example, any, if you're going up the Jolly Cut, if you're out driving, and we have the surface, there's some grass there. Maybe we'll put in a little flower up at the top. And underneath that topsoil, we see different types of sediment. So I'll just characterize it with a little bit of a signal. And, when we see this, what we're looking at is the passage of time. Each one of these layers, or what we refer to as strata, fancy word for layer, it represents a different period on the earth. So we're moving through time, and as we excavate, we see, yes, some of these fossils, for example, A over here, it was found very low. B, it was found above A, and C was found above B, and we call this the law of superposition. Now, the law of superposition simply states things that are deeper, well, they're older. So deeper things are older things. So physical anthropology, biological anthropology, this is pretty much the way it started. However, in more recent times, what we have been able to do is move beyond lining up skulls. We look for something that's called a homology. And this is an evolutionary feature. Okay, it's something that's been inherited from one individual, for example, A, and we see it in B as well, and we see it passed on to C. From C, we see it passed on to D, passed on to E, F. You get the idea. And there's a number of different types of evolutionary features that we might be looking at. So I'm just going to go right up here to the top. For example, we could look at teeth, or our dentition. We do have a very specific dental pattern, us and our relatives, and it's different from, for example, monkeys, New World monkeys, or say a gibbon. Well, not a gibbon, or perhaps a capuchin monkey. I'm thinking here. Our dental pattern, it's quite specific. The other type of thing that we see passed on from one generation to the next generation would be bipedalism. We have a structure, an anatomical structure, that allows us to walk as a biped on two legs. The other things that we began to look at as time progressed, and from this perspective, physical anthropology is quite new, ultimately. Next to dentition, I'll try and squeeze it in here. Do a double helix, and you get the idea that eventually we were able to extract DNA from some of the material. For example, we have a well-preserved tooth here. a little bit of organic material, and we can pull out DNA, and we can begin to compare that material. Okay, so physical anthropology, it is perhaps more of a natural science than a social science, interested in genetics, interested in the origins of humankind, connections between the so-called races, something that we refer to as the various ancestries that we have. Okay, that gives you some insight into the four fields of anthropology. Make sure that you've taken a look at your readings and the material that's been posted on my canvas, okay, or Avenue. Great. Take care.